Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the idea that the globalists, are frantically pushing because it destabilizes Western society. This notion that the West, the white West, the wealthy white West, has always been super racist, super misogynist, oppression everywhere you look, and this is something that really only today these enlightened, wonderful globalists, they're rescuing society, Western society, from this evil and from this oppression of racism and misogyny and oppression of women and that sort of thing. So they're saying it's always been bad, uh, but But if it is this bad, why are they having to tell so many lies and make so many inventions to pretend that it's an epidemic when it's nothing like an epidemic? It's absurd. So let's take a closer look at this. Now, I'm um, I'm sort of pushing the 3 score age now, and so when I went to school, it would have been, especially primary school and early high school, it would have been in the thick of this so-called oppression, this evil racism and that sort of thing. And I don't remember ever viewing kids from other races, be they Arabs or black, or it wasn't so many black, Arabs definitely, or just Eastern Europeans, anything like that. I don't remember seeing them as different. They were just other kids at school. I don't remember teachers encouraging any attitudes towards these again, the Arabs and all that sort of thing, and people from, say, Yugoslavia, or then Yugoslavia, today Serbia, Croatia. So I don't remember teachers encouraging that, or any adults or anything that way at all. I don't remember any sign of racism, be it amongst kids or adults. Now there were if the behaviour of the individuals or the group was very different, and uh, unlike the behaviour of the people that were forming the majority, then that would encourage comment. Would you call it racism? It wasn't based on race. It was based on differences in behaviour, and only that. I don't remember any racist thing. That purely race was the issue. It never was. Certainly not that I remember. But there was, as I say, an issue to do with behaviour. Now, for example, when Vietnamese people first came to Australia in the 70s, a lot of them were rural peasants, and they came and they lived the life that they lived in Vietnam. They're in another country, another culture, another place. Instead of straw huts out in the middle of nowhere, they had houses, and yet they still wanted to live the same life. So they go and buy chickens and keep them in the kitchen cupboards, and would do all sorts of things that they had done when they lived as rural peasants in a third world country in Vietnam. And they, as much as government assistance was given and advisors, that it was very difficult for them to change any of the behaviours that they'd acquired. Now, you'd think anybody with any sort of common sense would say, well, hold on, I'm in a new country. I'm in a different place with different ways of doing things. The reason I put the chickens in the kitchen cupboard is because the soldiers and the Viet Cong and all these guys kept coming through the village and stealing my chickens. That's why I put them in the cupboard. Um, or the rapacious, corrupt government tax collectors would come and steal my chicken. So that's why I keep them in the cupboard now. But in Australia, there's no Viet Cong, there's no armies running around, there's no war going on, there's no arbitrary tax collectors roaming around grabbing things. None of those things exist anymore. So I don't need to put the chickens in the kitchen cupboard, but they would still do it anyway. So there are behavioural differences. I'm not singling out the Vietnamese in particular, just giving that as an example. The Arabs, again, Maltese. A lot of these people weren't sophisticated city people, far from it. Many of them were pretty basic folks, and many of whom were illiterate in their own language, and they wanted to maintain those habits and customs when they came to a Western country. So this left them as easy targets, not for racism, to be singled out for their strange behaviour and their inability, complete inability, I mean comprehensive inability to adjust to the new life that they had. They'd also hang around in groups, they wouldn't learn English and so on. So there were derogatory comments made about these people as a group based on their behaviour. Um, to look back at it today, or even as of this minute, to sort of consider that as racism is absurd. I don't ever remember it was about racism, and I don't remember the race even being an issue. I just don't recall it. Now, if it was, I'd certainly remember it, and I'd remember the names that would be used purely on the basis of race, and it wasn't. So I don't believe that existed. It existed in terms of behaviour, but not in terms of the race in isolation. To me, as a kid, it was pretty much invisible. I didn't really think about it. There was a teacher. I remember a teacher came. One of the teachers was Indian with a very heavy accent and didn't speak English that well. Why for you leave your seat? And had trouble, and that was a thing. But again, I don't recall the race ever being an issue. The way the guy spoke, there are other sort of mannerisms that were typical of people from that part of the world, and they were mentioned. But I don't recall anything even resembling or coming close to what today we would call, even then, would be called racism. Now, looking at say, misogyny, I went to quite one of my relatives, family, one of the relatives in the family was reasonably well-to-do, insisted that I go to a fancy school for a while, and you were trained to respect women. There wasn't a whit of misogyny or anything about oppression of women. I mean, if you look at it through a purely Marxist lens, everyone is oppressed. But you were taught quite with a fairly brutish sort of thing if you got it wrong. But you were taught to stand up when a lady entered the room. If you were sitting at a table and the lady stood up, you had to stand up as well. If you were walking on the road, you had to walk on the side closest to where the cars are, so that this is going back to the old days of the horse and carriage, so the lady doesn't get splashed if the carriage goes through a puddle or something. So there were other. You had to wait in eating. You had to wait until the lady had started to eat before you ate at a table. There was just an endless array of what were termed as good manners. If a lady spoke, you were supposed to be quiet while she spoke, and so you had to listen and be attentive. And there were all. I don't recall anything that would, again, and these were in the days before the word misogyny really existed. There was no idea that women were oppressed any more than men were oppressed. Class oppression was you could say was an issue, far bigger issue than anything to do with gender. And there was also a view that men had a very solemn responsibility to be the breadwinners and bring home the bacon, as it were, and take that responsibility. If there's no food on the table, then as a man you are shamed. You are shamed because you failed to make sure there's food on the table for your wife, and the assumption was, of course, children as well. They are dependent on you. You must bring home the bacon. You cannot drink, you cannot gamble, you cannot do anything. You must bring home the bacon. You are responsible for their welfare. If they're not doing any good, that's because you made it that way. So this is in terms of the family, of course, but so we drilled very much as children to say your responsibility is to make that money and bring it home. Now her responsibility was to be a partner in procreation and so on. And many women worked until they got married. But the purchasing power of the paycheck back in those days, for certainly, nearly anyone who had a full-time job, the purchasing power of the paycheck was enough to support a wife and dependent family, whereas today it's not. The average wage was enough. And if people wanted to do better, sometimes the women may work part-time. They'd work until they got married or till they got pregnant. Then they'd go back to work part-time when the children were old enough to attend school and these sorts of things. And if you had children young enough when the children were, say, themselves, in senior high school or 18 years old and so on, you could go back to work. So it wasn't unusual for women in their mid-40s. The children were all grown up and they went back to work, and the work may not have been the best paying jobs. They were working at chain food stores, grocery stores. That it was that sort of work, but that was could bring a lot of income in and give them a comfortable retirement, maybe enough left over to help the children buy their first house and that sort of thing. But again, the ratio of purchasing power was very different in those days. But there was no idea that the idea was that as the man brought home the bacon and took that responsibility and took the slings and arrows of being treated like shit at his job and working long hours, busting his ass, that sort of thing, that he in turn should have the final say on the money. But that wasn't often the case. Even as a kid, there were plenty of households where the guy definitely wasn't making the final decision. But nonetheless, this idea that misogyny was rampant was absurd. Women were saved or spared from that responsibility, and men had to take it. Women also were treated very leniently in courts and so on. They were viewed as not really responsible for doing the wrong thing, and whereas men took full responsibility. So what a woman may get, good behaviour bond or something like that, a man could get a couple of years in prison. So men were viewed as responsible adults with agency, whereas women were not, and therefore they were given much lesser punishments and were treated much more leniently and with kid gloves. This was the same at school, by the way. Certainly in primary school, there was a circular that I remember reading where the Department of Education said, "Well, look, you don't have to mark girls. This is in exams. You don't have to mark girls quite as tough as you mark the boys, because they don't have to find their way in the world and do bring home the bacon, as I mentioned earlier." So there wasn't any so women were less than men, or men had to take that responsibility, all of it, and that was the dividing line. But to say that was somehow misogyny or so on is absurd. The reason women have to work today isn't because of equality or equity or anything to do with that. It's because the decline in purchasing power of the paycheck in the Western world has declined so much that even with two average wage incomes, the husband and wife or whatever, two average wage incomes still has less purchasing power than one wage did in 1970. That's how much purchasing power has been eroded. So I just wanted to deal with that issue of that misogyny and racism has always been the case. It never was in my experience, and I had a lot. The folks travelled around a bit, so I got to see quite a few different places and so on, and dealing in different languages, and then in high school there for a while that we were in an area that was where it was, I don't know, a quarter or a third white, I suppose. But I don't recall any racism, if there was, and the instances of what are called racism today you've really got to strain hard to see it that way. And in my view, at least, the entire racism um, debate is a utter fantasy and utter hoax, just dreamed up by the globalists to create social division. Same with misogyny and gender conflict. They're all invented by the globalists to assist them in disrupting and demoralising society, so they can force the globalist project on us without us having the the social cohesion to fight back. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.